Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Deleted Scenes from Sunday's Sermon. Today's topic, the difference between tradition and traditionalism. Listen to what the Word of God says in John chapter 20, verse 19. On the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Did you know that there's a difference between tradition and traditionalism? This past Sunday, we learned that in the Gospel of John, 3 different times, the Bible tells us that people did things out of fear for the Jewish religious leaders. It happened first in John chapter 7 with the crowd. Then it happened in John chapter 19 with Joseph of Arimathea. And then it happened here in John chapter 20 with the disciples who were locked up the day that Jesus rose from the grave. The Jewish religious leaders had a stranglehold on the people that kept them from engaging God the way that God was revealing himself to his people, namely through Jesus Christ, his Son. Now, this reality gives us an opportunity to talk about the difference between tradition and traditionalism in the church. So let's begin by getting a good definition of understanding what's the difference. So here's a good working definition for tradition. Tradition can be defined as the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is actually the exact opposite. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. Tradition are things that we continue to do in the church today that have been passed down to us from previous generation. Maybe through decisions that were made in the church before we were even born, or maybe through practices that have been handed down that were deemed to be good and helpful in our following of Jesus Christ. Take, for example, the fact that here at our church, we observe the Lord's Supper on the first Sunday of the month. There are other churches that observe the Lord's Supper every Sunday of the year, where we do it on the first Sunday of the month. Now, does the Bible come out and say you must observe the Lord's Supper only on the first Sunday of the month, and that's the only time that you could do it? No, it doesn't say that. The Bible simply tells us that as often as you eat, this is the way you should observe the Lord's Supper. So that's a tradition that we have in our church. But let's say on a particular Sunday, and we're only using this as an example, on a particular Sunday, maybe the pastor of the church is traveling out of town, and the council comes together and they make a decision that because of that, on this particular Sunday, we're going to observe the Lord's Supper. Instead of on the first Sunday of the month, we're going to do it on the second Sunday of the month. Now, would that be breaking tradition in the church? Well, at one level, yes, it would. But at another level, it wouldn't, because you're still observing the Lord's Supper once a month in the church. Now, somebody who's stuck in traditionalism will look at that and say, no, you're wrong. You're not allowed to observe the Lord's Supper on any other Sunday except on the first Sunday of the month. This is the way that we have always done it. And you're wrong in doing that. And maybe they might go as far as saying you're sinning against God by doing that. You see, tradition focuses on a particular practice in the church. Traditionalism has to do with our attitude towards that practice that's in the church. And the reason traditionalism, remember the difference, tradition, the living faith of the dead, traditionalism, the dead faith of the living, the reason why traditionalism falls short is for 3 different reasons. Let me share the first one, and that is there are going to be exceptions to the rule. The second reason is we don't live for the traditions, we don't exist for the traditions, but the traditions exist for us. And then number 3, our old traditions can be replaced with new traditions in the church. Remember tradition? The living faith of the dead. Traditionalism, the dead faith of the living. Traditionalism falls short because it fails to recognize that God is not a static God, but that God is a dynamic God. When Jesus called us to be his disciples, he said to us, follow me. That means that Jesus is always on the move. And our responsibility is to catch up with Jesus. Now, this doesn't mean that the Word of God changes, but how we apply the Word of God and how we live out the Word of God can change depending on the situation that we're in, or maybe even the generation that we're in. Jesus is always calling the church forward, and we can follow him in faith, knowing that where Jesus is, the Spirit is going to give us the power to go there, and that Jesus will give his church the same thing he gave those disciples who were locked up in the upper room for fear of the Jewish leaders back in John chapter 20. And what was that? He gave them, and he gives us, his peace. Thank you for tuning in, and may God richly bless you.